Welcome. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. My name's Matt, and this is our very first ever UX Mastery meetup group. Our very first careers panel. So we've got a bunch of UXers here that are going to talk about their careers and their thoughts on careers in user experience design. So just very quickly, what is UX Mastery? UX Mastery is a website founded by Luke and myself for aspiring user experience designers. So we publish a ton of articles, we've got ebooks, we run regular webinars. We also have a community forum. If you haven't discovered the online forums, it's a great place to get advice, get support, get your questions answered about user experience. And we also do occasional in-person workshops. Speaking of which, we have a few workshops coming up very soon that we're really proud of. We've run these a couple of times and they're well received. So we're running a workshop about sketchnoting. We're running a workshop about introduction to user experience, which is great for graphic designers and business analysts and marketers that want to get their head around user-centered design. And we have a workshop specifically for mobile, designing for mobile, designing device-independent user experiences. So go to uxmastery.com/training if you're interested in any of these workshops. If you're doing the tweet thing, hashtag UX Careers is the hashtag that we'd like you to use for this event tonight. And just very quickly on our panel this evening, we have myself, Matt. To my right here we have Ben Rowe from Thirst Studios. We have Jamie Chin from Simplicit. And Luke, my partner in crime for UX Mastery. We've also got Rebecca Jackson, who's kindly volunteering to graphically record our conversation tonight. So Rebecca's just going to poke around at the back and do her thing, and we'll see what she comes up with by the end of the evening. So, very quickly, to kick things off, what I might ask each of the panellists to do is just say your name, what you're doing, where you're working, and a little bit about how you got started in user experience. Ben.
Hi everyone, how you going? Ben Rowe, I'm a UX designer. I've been working where I am at the moment, which is Thirst Studios, for about 2 years now. And my career in UX is, I suppose it's a little bit different than some, but probably not. I think a lot of people make a transition from UX from another career, and for me it was marketing. I studied marketing at uni and really loved marketing for about 10 years of my life, and then had a bit of a midlife crisis at about the age of 30 and decided I didn't want to do marketing at all. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do next after that, but and UX back then was sort of kind of a new-ish kind of thing. So I sort of knew that I wanted to be involved in the web.
When was back then? How long ago was that?
Back then was 7 years ago or so, I think. And so I wanted to like keep in the web and do stuff online. I didn't quite know what role it was going to be. And so for a few years I was kind of just trying a few different things. I was an account manager for a while. I then worked as a BA for a while. And as I did that, I kind of realised that, and UX started to emerge, and I kind of realised that I wanted to do that. So I don't know, I've kind of done a few different things along the way to get to where I am now. But the thing I guess I've learnt is that everything that you do in the past kind of adds up to where you are, and you can kind of put together a story based on your experience. And for me, I felt like there was a few years where I didn't really know what the hell I was doing. But looking back, I can sort of say now, well, actually, I'm a UX designer who's got a bit of a marketing focus because I've got that background. Done a few things that have helped me get to where I am now. And so, yeah, been able to kind of weave that story a little bit.
Cool. And Jamie?
Hi, I'm Jamie, and I'm currently working in Simplicit as a lead designer. So I basically I graduated from RMIT, and then I head back to Malaysia, and then I got into advertising. So for a couple of years, I think about 6 years, I've been working in advertising and doing all the cool stuff. Like, every designer just dreamed to be in advertising, and that's what I did. And I started to feel as if that whatever that I do has always been just campaign, and it was just a very quick sort of fame. Like, yeah, people know you for this campaign for a while, and after that the campaign ends in a month, and that's it. And a lot of stuff that I designed back then, it was just online ads, and it was just website, and I realized a lot of people were not thinking about usability. And eventually, about 6 years after that, I got burned out, and I came back to Australia, and I was like, I really want to focus on usability. And I've got into another agency, but I was still trying to figure out. But as I start building e-commerce website, that's when I start to realize, it's really important, and it's going to make a big difference when someone uses a website. So that's when I spoke to a headhunter, and eventually she kind of pointed me like, yeah, why haven't you thought about UX? And I was like, yeah, I did, but I have no idea, because I'm just a visual designer, and to make that move was kind of hard, and I wasn't sure whether there's opportunity. And she said, yeah, just give it a go and just meet up with Simplicit. And yeah, I've been with Simplicit for 3 years, and I'm happy till now. Yeah.
Can we just possibly get a quick show of hands, everyone who has a graphic design or visual design background in the room? Cool. And anyone with a marketing background? And anyone want to volunteer other backgrounds? Because I'm curious what the gap is. So so BAs? Yep. And any others? Development? Yeah, cool. How many developers have we got? A couple, cool. Interesting. It is a bit of a diverse mix. And Luke, do you want to give us your checkered history?
Yeah, sure. So as people have touched on, UXers tend to come from fairly different backgrounds. My background's in film production. So I studied film, which has a lot of crossover with UX in terms of visual thinking and collaborative work and things like that. So I've found, having come from that background, running my own web design business for a few years, and I read a book that was about design ethics, and I felt really challenged by that to make sure that the stuff that I was bringing into the world was actually going to be really useful. Didn't want to bring in stuff that wasn't going to be helpful, and I found my way to doing a usability test with Census, and that sort of opened my eyes to this idea of user-centered design. And that from there, sort of implementing some of those things into my work, got more and more involved in UX, and until I'm here today, co-running UX Mastery with Matt.
So the way we're going to work this conversation is I've got a bunch of questions here which I'm going to throw at the panel, and I'll probably have my own opinion on a few of them as well, which I'll chime in. But yeah, we want to make this reasonably interactive. So once I've kind of covered off a few bases, we're going to open up the floor to you guys to not be shy, ask whatever questions you like. So I'll kick things off and ask Jamie about your visual design background and how much of your visual design background you think helps you as a UXer.
Well, from the way I see that visual and UX, basically it helps each other a lot. When it comes to visual design, UX actually helps me narrow down a lot. I mean, it's very easy when it comes to design. We tend to just throw everything that we want, like, oh, this is awesome, this is what I think that we should have all this, but we've never actually thought about, like, seriously, is this really important and to the users, and in the long run, what does it bring, Is it gonna simplify someone else's life, or is it just gonna make someone else, give them a headache and stuff like that? So in that sense, UX actually helps me a lot to focus around my design. And when it comes to UX, it's more like the design helps me push the boundary of, like, where we can take it. It doesn't have to be boring. I get it, like, sometimes we think there's a flow, but there's a lot more ways that you can do. So design actually helps me push mine to be whatever UX stuff to become more real and better. Yeah.
How about you, Ben? You have a marketing background. Have you upskilled in your visual design chops, or do you bring a lot of other stuff to the table that means that hasn't been necessary?
No, I don't know. For me, I've always been interested in visual design. I don't have a background in actually learning it, but I've found that getting more into that, it's been something that I try and kind of practice and study and learn a bit about, in the background. And I think it is important to have some sort of visual. I think that, a lot of UX designers come from a visual background. I don't think you have to be particularly visual, but I think it's important to kind of understand a pretty good understanding of visual design as well.
And what about yourself? Like, how did you go from film to UX? What role did visual design play along the journey there?
So I never formally studied any sort of visual design. I was always sort of self-taught, even in basic web design stuff. So I think some of that hunger for more formal understanding of how you do design is what actually led to being curious enough to go and find out about some of this stuff. In terms of crossover with film, like I mentioned before, whatever your background is, I think it tends to flavour your approach into whatever roles you might go into. So it's not like there's a user experience role that is sort of concrete and locked down. It's going to be very much what you bring to that role. And for me, that looks like I enjoy sketching and I also enjoy coding. So this kind of mixture of creative and technical is sort of met in UX, because you get to sort of follow this product design process. You get to talk to developers, you get to talk to designers. I find that really fascinating.
So I started with that question because that's the question that we get asked a lot at UX Mastery. People email us and go, I'm not a visual designer, can I still get a job as a UXer? And I think the answer we usually give is yes, but don't expect to just walk into this amazing role. It's something that you need to work towards, and you need to get some experience and you need to kind of become a rounded generalist player. Is that fair? Do you guys think that good UXers are generalists?
Yeah, I reckon. I mean, this idea, we talk about this idea of a T-shaped professional where you've got a breadth of understanding across a bunch of things, whether that's from your background in visual design or business development or business analysis or development, whatever, and then sort of one strong speciality, which sort of...
Can you elaborate for us, Luke, on, for people in the room who might not be familiar with the overwhelming spectrum of scope that the user experience umbrella tries to cover, like what are those various areas?
Yeah, I mean, so looking at a rough UX process, you sort of start at the beginning with business needs analysis sort of stuff. So people with a BA, like business analysts, that kind of stuff, really strongly there. Might feed into some user research with going and finding out more about the audience, which of course then leads into a lot of analytical sort of stuff with unpacking that, seeing what it actually means to the project, what the opportunities are in that, and then through concept development, you get to sort of have big visions for things, ideas. It's not sort of locked down into functionality yet, but you're sort of getting there through prototyping, and then all the production roles around visual design, development, coding, that kind of stuff. So it's looking at that process. UX design wants to take that from end to end because it likes to sort of steer that and keep the user, like it's a user-centered design process. So that's why it's so broad. But UX roles might be particular to do with the structure of some of that coming out of the user research into the conceptual stuff, looking at menus and navigation and stuff, and there'll be an information architecture role, which is one of the earlier sort of labels for a UXer, I guess about 10 years ago. It's quite the thing. Yeah.
Another question that we got asked a lot is, what does a day in the life of look like? How would you answer the question? What does a day in the life look like for yourself, Ben?
I think that's one of the awesome things about UX, in the fact that every day can be quite different. It can vary between the clients that you've got and the jobs that you do. So I work for an agency where there's 8 of us, and so we have a mix of small organisations who we do end-to-end websites for, and then sometimes UX consulting gigs for, where we don't do any website build stuff, but we just are focusing on UX. And so those...
So what's an example of, say, focusing on UX but not involved in the...
Okay, so as you know, you've worked on this client too, Matt, done some work with Deakin Uni recently where I've gone in as a UX consultant, and that has involved everything from talking to users, researching users, usability testing with students mostly, but also some requirements gathering with different stakeholders in the business, and all the way up to sort of visual design. So that's a big client who understands what UX is, but then also sometimes you've got smaller clients who don't necessarily know what UX is or have a different understanding of what UX is. And one of the frustrating things of a smaller client sometimes is that they think that, oh, we'll just give it to the UX guy can just do a bit of UX. Do a bit of UX-y stuff, make it just a bit
of UX on
make it a bit usable. And so between a small client like that and a big client like Deakin, there's a whole lot of variety. Getting back to what the actual question was, and I love that. I really do enjoy sometimes having to sell UX. Sometimes the client understands what UX is, so you get straight into it. That mix is what I really enjoy.
How about yourself? What's a day in the life look like for Jamie Chin?
Well, as a visual designer in Simplicit, I guess, like as what Luke say, in UX there's actually a very wide range. So I mean, all of us have our own specialty, and basically for me, it's like I sit under basically visual, but at the same time, I still work across some of the UXy stuff where maybe I'll be involved in workshop. So it requires a lot of like planning together with maybe a person who's running the workshop, and we plan how we can get whatever the information that we need to come up with a design or concept. And then we'll plan it, and then I'll just do the whole concept, designing and stuff, and eventually he'll take it into testing, and while he's doing the testing, I will be the one that will be at the background iterating all the stuff and making changes to make sure as we test, we keep feeding back in all the good stuff, and then we'll just test it with more users and just re-authenticate whatever that we do. So at the end of the day, the product that we come up with is actually like, yeah, exactly what the user wants. Yeah.
And Luke, this question is a bit tricky for you because Luke and myself spend about half of our time on UX Mastery and half our time doing consulting work for clients. So what does a day in the life look like for you when you're wearing your Xperia UX design consulting hat?
Yeah, so if I think back to like 10 years ago, being a visual designer or doing user interface design, I was obviously doing a lot of Photoshop or sketching, and I find it quite funny to think of myself as a designer these days who spends a lot of time in Excel. So doing spreadsheets and stuff, whether that's sort of planning things or mixing data around. There's also this idea of the iterative nature of a user-centered design process. So while at one point I might be sort of conceptualizing for some other things, I might be then taking feedback from other iterations and then also planning future iterations for the next sort of round. So it's kind of this past, current, future sort of view of design. Yep.
Jamie, what was the hardest thing that you found moving into UX design from visual design?
I guess trying to understand exactly what UX actually covers.
What would you say to someone who asks you what UX covers?
I mean, initially when I first got into Simplicit, I just thought like, hey, I'm just interested in usability, and I'm good at it. So I thought I wasn't really sure about how wide it is until I got in, and then, I got thrown into projects, and then you start learning a lot about exactly who the customer are, and it's all different based on different projects. And I guess that was the challenging part, because previously in agency, all you get is just design this, and they don't tell you anything, and you just expect that it works. But at the end of the day, does it come up with a result that you want? Not really. I mean, it's sort of you just trial and error sort of thing. But in UX, it's really learning that whole thing, and I found it really beneficial. Yeah. So that was the hardest, but yeah, it was good still.
What's the hardest thing for you, Ben?
Can you repeat the question? I've forgotten what the actual question was.
The hardest thing that you found in transitioning from marketing to user experience?
I think for me, just like feeling like I had the confidence to actually say, at some point kind of say, I can actually call myself a UX designer now. Because I think I sort of felt like I needed to have a certain amount of runs on the board before I could actually go out and say, yeah, I'm looking for UX jobs, I've got UX experience. And so I did that just by hard work, I guess. I kind of spent a bit of time doing some freelance jobs on the side for my actual day job. Tried to really build up a portfolio by just kind of working on some projects, and not necessarily real projects, a few fictitious projects too, where I sort of thought, okay, well, how would I look at redesigning, this particular website or something like that, and just coming up with enough sort of material that I could put into my portfolio, into my sort of tool of tricks to then actually go out and say, I've got enough skills now to be a UX designer. So I spent a couple of years just sort of, slogging it after hours at work to do that. But it paid off, I guess.
I think that's a good point, actually, is that there generally aren't junior UX roles advertised, or they just don't exist.
Yeah.
I think that clients are becoming educated about what a user experience designer means, and what they expect from that is that there's someone who can deliver measurable results through design, through user research.
Yeah.
And so backing yourself to be able to say, yes, I can deliver measurable results, I empathise, and
Yeah.
I probably felt like a little bit like a fraud if I was to call myself a UX designer.
That's how I felt too.
My background's development.
But the great thing about UX is it is easy for you to come up with a portfolio of, as I say, fictitious projects, identify things. It's not actually things you're necessarily getting paid for. You don't have an actual client, but you can identify a website that you use that is frustrating, think about the ways that you might improve it, go out and talk to a group of friends who might be sort of in the target audience, and kind of create your own portfolio pieces.
Yeah, cool. What about yourself, Luke?
I reckon starting in UX, the hardest thing for me was process. I think in general designers love process, and they like to, how do I do this? I'm going to do this, and then this will happen, and then this will come out at the end. And I think for me, going from no formal design background into doing web development and then transitioning into UX, I still got stuck by that. And I think coming out the other side of lots of conversations about that kind of stuff, I think the idea of focusing on principles instead of process when you're getting started is really important. It means you can be very adaptive to the culture of the place where you're working. You're not necessarily going to come in and sort of dominate, the way an existing team might be working. Plus, things start to make sense a lot better about why you might do this sort of process in this situation, but not this one. So process for me was the thing. But I guess the flip side of that is a lot of UX is really difficult, and that's one of the best things. I find it really challenging. It's all about problem solving and stuff like that. I actually really enjoy the difficulty of it. Yeah.
Ben, you touched on portfolios, and as we know, visual designers, the portfolio is kind of a part of the deal when you're pitching yourself to a client or to an employer. What does a UX portfolio look like?
I think a UX portfolio is a little bit different to a visual design portfolio. I think, as a visual designer, it's all about making everything as beautiful as possible. But I think actually with a UX design portfolio, it's actually more about unpacking what the problem was. So on a particular job, of course it's lovely to show the end, visual, how it all finished up. But I think what's more important is to kind of uncover what the process is of how you understood what the problem was in the first place, and how you then came up with a solution around it. And so, because I'm not a visual designer, my UX portfolio doesn't look particularly pretty, but I've got a combination of sketches through to wireframes, and a bit of a narrative around that as to, what were we thinking, what were we trying to sort of hypothesise that the problem was, and how we came around to finding a solution, and try and just present that as a story as opposed to beautifully finished PSDs.
Does that ring true for you, Jamie? How did you?
As for me, because from a visual design background, I have a lot of agency work, so how I just approached Simplicit back then was just basically bring whatever work that I had, and I was just basically selling on exactly what my thoughts are when I was designing stuff, and it's more like just telling them about usability, that what I think could be improved based on whatever work that went live. But at the same time, it was more as well some of the stuff, and I just explained about my thoughts, why did I do it. So that was how I actually sold my portfolio to my company back then. So
Yeah, I guess for me, I've managed to survive for quite a few years without a portfolio, but my personal preference was to find sort of natural relationships in networking and sort of work with people that kind of had seen the way I work or knew me. So I was lucky in having that for most of the work that I picked up. Having said that, because there's quite a lot of crossover between UX and visual design, I think it's definitely becoming an expectation that you would have some sort of folio. And I totally agree with what the others have said, that it's about telling that story of a process, whether it's really messy or not, including a bit of where you've come from in terms of data or business sort of brief sort of stuff, and then showing how you got there. So, yeah, my folio that I now have is very messy. It's not very glossy and good to look at on every page, but it definitely tells a story, and I use that as something that I can present and then tell my story as I did anyway, but I've got things in front of me to be able to support that.
So Jamie and Ben have talked a little bit about agency side work. Luke, I know that it wasn't that long ago that you took a role that you were more of an in-house designer rather than kind of freelancing. I want to ask you, it's been said that UX is everyone's job, not just one person's. So how do you go about instilling a user-centered culture in your place of work?
Yeah, that's a broad question. It really depends on the workplace. So whether the place you're coming into is very receptive of UX, or whether it's still a bit foreign to them, it's a bit of education. So perhaps 5 years ago, it was a lot more of the education sort of stuff. And these days, as I just sort of mentioned, people are a bit more savvy about what it is, and you can sort of step forward a little bit more and get into other stuff. So wherever the business sort of lays in that spectrum, if it's very much about introducing ideas, then again, going back to principles and having some discussions about that kind of stuff means you don't sort of stand on any toes with process. You know, if you can pull stories, you know, about other ways that a user-centered design process has actually had a really positive effect on the outcome of a project, then, you know, you sort of flag those and say, look, you know, we could do this too, this is how it works. And with those early things, sort of being able to chip in with smaller projects until you build trust, and then working up to doing bigger projects. So that's for that side. For people that are a bit more savvy about it, then I guess coming in, still a lot of it is about culture, but yeah, I guess you get to start a bit deeper with that stuff. Yeah.
Jamie, do you have any specific tips based on your experience for how to sell UX to a client or to an organisation?
The way I'll sell UX is more like nowadays everyone is just becoming very time poor and becoming more savvy. So everyone is just trying to save time whenever they can. So it's not just about just brand anymore. It's more about the whole experience of using something. You just don't build something and expect that to, you know, stick with the users. It's more about like their experience of using it. So how do we actually, we always just ask the client like, why are you doing this and how is this going to simplify someone else's life? So in that sense, that's how I usually sell, and at the same time it's almost coming to the whole like understanding the users more. It's helps the business a lot in a sense that it does reduce a lot of the risk of failure at the end. So doing UX is more like a quick testing of any ideas that you have in the cheapest form, like rapid prototyping and stuff, and it sort of help you reduce all the resourcing wastage and, you know, money that comes with it at the end of the day, and then the project fails. Yeah.
What about yourself, Ben? Have you got some particularly memorable moments when you've had to put more effort into championing the importance of user-centered design than others? You don't have to mention client names.
No. But I think the one technique in particular that I've always found really useful, and I think it's because clients often really very far removed from their users actually using their own website. So I've always found that if you can get the client in front of the user, or even just, you know, we've done video recordings of usability sessions, and then, you know, cut it up and just show some highlights and then show it back to management. Give them a real flavour for how much trouble users can actually have when they're using, you know, the client's website. I think that actually kind of brings it alive.
Yep.
You can do the whole, there's a lot of business benefits for getting into UX as far as increasing your conversions and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's nothing as powerful as showing a video reel of highlights that says, you know, this is a typical user on your site and they're having all sorts of trouble and it's not all that hard for you to fix these things.
Yeah, right. I asked this question from a slightly selfish point of view because I'm happy to own up and say that I've had an in-house role in the past where, like, on reflection, it probably didn't get the best result that I could have because I had this idealistic view of the change that I was going to be able to affect, when reality was it was a large, siloed, politically sensitive environment in a corporate that like one person, I'm not an organisational change consultant, and I couldn't actually kind of get buy-in from the key stakeholders that I needed to. And I realised that actually this wasn't an organisation that was ready to embrace the kinds of hard questions that needed to be asked at that point, and I had to like make peace with that.
Yeah, I think it's one thing with big organisations as well. It's not as easy as just identifying a problem and fixing it, because there is a whole lot of political stakeholder barriers that you've got to jump through. And I've spent, on a similar client, acting more as a business therapist or something to try and, even just get the right people in the right room to have a conversation about stuff. All of that is, a big part of it as well.
I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to throw the questions over to the floor now. So who would like to ask our learned panel? And feel free to ask anything. It doesn't need to be specific about, one technique or careers or whatever. Is anyone keen to pick their brains? Otherwise, I have plenty up the back.
So leading on to getting stakeholder buy-in and who has to be around the table, the flip side of that is who's on the table from your side. So is it one person, or who goes in from your agency?
So the question was, for those who may not have been able to hear, in terms of getting buy-in at an organisation, stakeholders on the client side are one thing, but who goes in from an agency in a typical user experience engagement? Do you want to take that one, Ben?
Yeah, sure. So in my experience, it's been me as the UX designer, and sometimes having my boss do that as well. In other cases, it's actually been where I've been working with a client in an organisation, and we've got a good relationship together, but it's our role to then sell that up the chain to their bosses, and sometimes I sort of go in with my client to help them, if that makes sense, and just trying to do that with as much justification as we can, that we have gone out and spoken to users and getting their feedback and getting their intentions as much as possible.
How does UX sales work at Simplicit, Jamie?
So basically, it'll normally just be my boss, or else it'll be the client engagement manager that actually goes out and meet the client. But once they get a rough brief, normally what they do is they just bring it back to the office. That's when they'll work with the team to kind of maybe just pick a lead or a designer and just talk about what sort of approach that we should sell, just to get that goal that the stakeholder wants, and then they'll just go back and just, sell it.
Ben, why don't you talk about the hiring and interview process for UX designers at Thirst?
Okay, so from my perspective,
So if someone was to apply to Thirst to get a UX role, like what can they expect? What should they prepare, and what can they expect the process to look like?
Yeah, so I think it's we're pretty big on cultural fit where I work, so it's sort of half the battle is sitting down and just talking to someone and making sure that you get a good feel that they're going to fit in. But then going back to the question before about the portfolio, we want to see some some record of work that they've done before, and that can be anything from the highly polished visual design to a whole bunch of sketches or anything like that. So we get a feel for how they would tackle a project, I guess.
Yeah. Down the front here.
Yeah, so as you mentioned about portfolios and sketches and wireframe, all of that, in most cases sometimes you don't feel all design yourself. You generally work in a team where it's really okay, let's say, to work on it, but you did work on it.
So the question is, if you've only worked on part of the process of a project, how do you present your contribution to that project without being misleading about the parts that you didn't work? Is that?
No. Well, my question was more about, is it okay just to present it since I mean, even if I did part of it, I would still have an idea of how the whole project was working, and if I was given the role, I was able to do it at the same time. But would that be okay from your perspective, or someone looking at what that's
What do you think, Lee?
Yeah, totally. I think UX is totally a collaborative medium, so people don't necessarily expect you to do everything end to end. You're working within a design team. And even going back to the previous question about who from the agency might go in to do a project. At the start of a UX project, you do a UX plan, and it's about sort of matching the resources and assets on the client side and the agency side and filling any gaps that you might have. So that kind of collaborative approach to design means that I don't think people fully expect that something you put on the page, unless it's a smaller project and you say, I've done all of this, that it's assumed that there's been a whole bunch of inputs to that.
I will say this though, I think that it is important that you demonstrate an understanding of the entire process, and that includes numbers. For example, if it was an e-commerce site and you were involved in part of the project, for example, the wireframes and the usability testing, and the outcome of that project was that conversion rates doubled and the company made $100 million more that year as a result of that conversion rate being improved, you need to know those numbers and be able to talk with them with authority. So if you're on a project, there's a good tip. If you're on a project, make sure that you get some stats over the before and after, that, like when the project's benchmarked, and then the measurable result that your team's effort has made. Because without those numbers, then you're just kind of talking about, yeah, we made it better. Like really, it's a lot more convincing to an employer if you've got some hard figures that you can say, the design made this difference, and
totally
these are the
that.
numbers. And it can be hard sometimes to get those numbers, but it's worth hunting them down and getting to know the rest of the project team and getting an understanding for the entire project so that you've got that data for your own personal career benefit, really.
And we've talked about this idea of telling a story with your portfolio, and literally it's beginning, middle, end as well, with dramatic curve and climax and a whole bunch of stuff. And I think that transparency of things, whether it's defining the business brief and then things you had to go through, hoops you had to jump through to get there, including the stuff that maybe didn't turn out. So you can actually be fairly honest about the tussle you had with trying to get to the solution, not just showing where you got it right, but also showing the stuff that you struggled with. It gives a good insight into the process that you did and what your capabilities are under pressure. And stuff.
And it's kind of, it sounds a bit naff, and some people make fun of it, but I think it's actually a useful addition to your portfolio to include photos of like the design room with all the post-its on the wall and the messy butcher paper, and maybe a photograph of you facilitating a meeting with the client and demonstrating. So I want to bring up, there's an article that Jared Spool from UIE wrote called The 5 Indispensable Skills to UX Mastery. Not related to UX Mastery at all, but the 5 skills that Jared Spool mentioned were sketching, storytelling, facilitating, presenting, and critiquing. So this is based on analysis that they did of some of the best UX designers I knew in the States, and what were the common skills between these individuals who were seen to be, at the top of their game. And they were the 5 things that all of these people did really well. That's a bit of a tangent, but I guess it demonstrates that, these are kind of life skills. These aren't skills in how to use Axure or Balsamiq mockups or how to create wireframes. These are the business skills that you can use in any career, but it just so happens that in user experience, they're 5 skills that it's really important to hone, and you can't just read a book on them and all of a sudden be better. There's kind of things that you chip away at throughout your career and that we all work on to get better at. Any other questions? Sketchnoting? Down the front. Sketchnoting.
Can you just explain and expand on that and why I think it's any of you or all of you?
Sure. I'm happy to take that one because I do create quite a few sketchnotes at conferences that I visit, and I have done some paid sketchnoting gigs. So sketchnoting is a word invented by a bloke named Mike Rohde, who wrote a book called The Sketchnote Handbook. And it was basically his word for taking visual notes. He was tired of taking written notes that looked boring and that he never referred to ever again. So he experimented with typography, experimented with different imagery and combining them in order to capture his notes in a more interesting fashion. And it turned out that it increased his retention. It increased his ability to recall stuff afterwards. The notes were more interesting to look at, so he was more likely to refer to them. And he shared them online, and people thought they were wonderful. And this kind of the meaning and the message was carried beyond the conference or the presentation or the meeting. And it sounds like it's completely unrelated to user experience design, but in fact, doing a lot of sketchnoting and doing what Rebecca's doing behind us here, where she's taking notes visually and using words, is a great way to practice your sketching skills, your listening skills, and your processing skills, because you're doing those three things at the same time. And, you know, harking back to Jared Spool's article, you know, getting better at listening and getting better at sketching, getting better at processing, they're all skills that can make you a better designer. So I'm a big believer that sketching and sketchnoting makes you a better designer for those reasons.
Yeah, I do.
No.
Loads and loads of sketching, not so much sketch noting.
Yeah.
There are a couple of fields that are quite common in the States called graphic recording and graphic facilitation. So graphic recording is basically what Rebecca's doing at the moment, large-scale sketchnoting. Graphic facilitation is a more interactive version of that, where there might be a meeting or a workshop, and the graphic facilitator is documenting the meeting and the conversation, but it's this feedback loop where someone in the meeting sees that what they've said has been captured on the board and they feel validated. It doesn't, you know, if they're like stuck on something and they keep coming back to it, they're not going to keep bringing it up because it's been captured there, and it changes the dynamic of the meeting. And it makes for a more engaging meeting because people feel like it's not just some boring meeting, it's being captured with a purpose. So, yeah, look, Luke and I are both big fans of sketching and sketchnoting as kind of a key part of being a UX designer. There was another question at the back.
Yeah, it was a question about the industry as it stands right now. You've got some panellists who have been working in UX for 7+ years. Does it feel, as an outsider to the industry, it feels like it's reaching a bit of a critical mass? Are we going to see a boom of advertised roles, or is it still going to be quite niche where people have to create their own opportunities?
That's a good question. Is UX about to reach critical mass, or do people still need to create their opportunities? Do you want to start with your response, Luke?
Sure. So there's a couple of bits to that question. If you're in the process of being recruited or wanting to be recruited, then often people ask, you know, do I need formal qualifications? And a couple of years ago, there wasn't any, you know, UX degrees as such. There were some interaction degrees, there were plenty of cognitive psychology degrees, visual design degrees, but nothing that fully captured, you know, this idea of UX as its own sort of thing. So I think going forward, that's going to become more of a thing. People often write in and say, do I need that sort of formal education? We say you don't at the moment, because people are hiring for cultural fit, and if you can demonstrate some skills and solid, you know, response to process and stuff, then you're in with a good go. Changes from, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I think they were a bit more buried in the larger companies that had a definite need for dealing with this website that had, you know, 1 million web pages. How are you going to start restructuring that? And that's where this idea of information architecture and that kind of stuff came through. But now that we're kind of in a culture that's, I mean, people use the idea of Apple bringing to the mainstream, which actually is an industrial design, not necessarily user-centered design, but popularising that idea that things should be usable and useful and meaningful, and that is permeating things in a bit more of a mainstream way. And so this is getting a bigger thing. I feel like at the moment there's plenty of UX roles advertised. I think there's a definite hunger that can't be filled, so it's a good opportunity to sort of cross from a different field at the moment. And going forward, of course, that'll sort of not be as easy to get into, but definitely now.
Ben or Jamie, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I just think that it is definitely growing, because from 3 years back, I don't remember hearing much about UX. You hear about it, but yeah, like you say, it was just niche. But I think with the whole like Steve Jobs, you know, Apple and stuff, everyone starts to see usability as more and things like that, and innovation. So you can tell, I mean, this couple of years, I've been working with a lot of clients, and they are starting to even form their own internal UX team. And they are very dependent on us, like bringing them on a journey and sort of teaching them about the whole UX so they can form their own team as well. So it's definitely an industry that's growing. Yeah.
And just quickly, I still think, like, I think UX has exploded in the last couple of years, but there's still a fair bit of misunderstanding as to what it exactly is. As you speak to UX recruiters, there's only about kind of 5% of them who actually know what UX is, I reckon, and there's a whole lot of others that that will call you up about a UX job, but in actual fact it's a visual design job. And there's a whole lot of, I think there's just a bit more maturity to happen in UX design before everyone really gets it. But that's kind of cool because it means that it's going to grow and it's going to mature, and yeah, we're all into it. So
if you jump in now, you get to help define what that means. I
yeah,
guess.
yeah.
But it's also important to remember that you don't have to be a UX designer to do UX design, and that if you're close to the fire, whether you're a developer, whether you're a visual designer, whether you're a BA, you know, there's going to be elements of your role where you're doing stuff that would normally fall into the role of a UX designer, and that's how you get some experience, and make sure that you identify and capitalize on those opportunities if, you know, heading towards doing this stuff full time is what you want to do.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment on the Apple thing too, because a good friend of mine described the effect that Apple's placing design at the forefront of what they do has had on everything, and that was that he explained that there's a ton of managers out there who, you know, manage these IT systems at work and then go home and play on their iPads and then come into the boardroom the next day and go, how come our product doesn't look as good as what I've got here? And that's why they're elevating the importance of design. And, like, you know, a lot of us have known that for a long time, that design's important, but it's like people that make decisions at that level are the ones that are finally getting it, and I think that that's part of the movement.
Mm.
Anyone else? Questions? Yes?
So how do you make things look better and easier to use? Like, how do you guys become good at it?
So there's two questions there, isn't there? How do you make things that are usable and useful and delightful?
Yeah.
And then how do you get better at it? How do you get better at what you do, Luke?
I think jumping in and giving it a go is a big part of it. That develops experience. So once you've developed experience, you can see where the conventions are and where you can break those conventions. And then, yeah, like you say, jumping in, giving yourself permission to innovate a bit. Combining that with this idea of having some visual skills, I think you can make things look good. The thing that's behind what making them look good is the usability, knowing the context for things, putting the right things in the right place at the right time, keeping it simple, but, you know, being aware of this sort of flow of this task to this task to this task makes it seem quite elegant, and that'll really sort of help this idea of being useful, but then also being usable. And once you get those things right, you can then sort of put the cherry on top and make it meaningful. So.
What is the job that you guys have been most proud of?
The job that we've been most proud of. Ben, why don't you take that one first?
Yeah, probably in the last 12 months I've been working for, I think I mentioned before, for Deakin Uni, and I've done a project that sort of involved, you know, kind of end-to-end UX from research to design, and also sort of a bit more senior kind of stakeholder management and stuff along the way. So it's been a pretty good all-round project. There's been plenty of times in that 12 months where I've felt like it was a complete disaster. But I finally, sort of 12 months now, I feel like it's been an incredible learning curve from a whole lot of different skills, and finally got to a solution which is going to be okay, I think.
So part of the pride comes from the challenging environment you're operating in?
Yeah, I think so. Like it's you know, it's quite easy to come up with something that's usable and beautiful and delightful if you don't have hurdles in the way. But the reality is sometimes as a UX designer you get involved with clients and with projects where there are some compromises that you need to make, and so yeah, I feel like I've achieved some sort of pride by managing some of those.
What's your proudest professional moment, Jamie?
I'll say I think the very first project I got thrown into was like ANZ, and was working together with the innovation team, and it was the Grow Money, which has just recently been launched after 2 years, and it's been like a whole continuous like 1.5 years working with them. It was on and off, you know. So now at the end when it's live, yeah, it works majority like whatever that we propose, but I mean, of course, there's always bits and pieces at the end when the client decides to throw stuff that's not what you propose. But I guess that's just how it is. But overall, I think it has come up as pretty good app. So yeah.
Yeah, I've been lucky too to do some work on some pretty fun projects, some household names that even just personality-wise have sort of appealed to me. I really enjoy working with them. I guess with the bigger projects, it's been about what rubbed off on the team and how I learned from the team too. So having left a little bit of a legacy. But probably the proudest moment is probably right down the other end of the spectrum, where my mum runs a pony parties business where she takes ponies to kids' parties, and helping her get that online business set up. She's just a sole operator, but having followed that user-centered design process from end to end and tinkered with it for so long, it's really running quite sweetly, so I'm quite proud of that.
Personally speaking, there was a project I worked on at Australia Post. It was the Australia Post Postcards app. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but basically you can take a photo with your iPhone, enter a little message and address in a handwritten font and pay with your credit card, and Australia Post will go and print a physical postcard and stick it in the mail. It's a fairly simple concept. There are already some other apps out there that did this, but working with the Australia Post team to make this app stand out based on user experience, and we had a real scare getting close to launch when Apple launched their Cards app, and we thought, we're differentiating based on user experience and now Apple's in the game. Do we back ourselves to go up against those guys? And we had a look at their app and it wasn't that great, and they ended up canning it anyway. And yeah, the product is great. It gets a ton of users. People love it. People love it when they're travelling and they don't have to find a stamp or a postcard to send home, and it's local postage because it's getting printed in Australia. And then it won a Moby Award, so I was wrapped with that, especially given that it's a large bureaucratic organisation and there were some significant hurdles in terms of stakeholder management. And the fact that the end product got out the door and was as good as it is, I was super proud of. Yeah. Yes?
Are there any, I guess, user-unfriendly practices that you guys see again and again and again and again? Is there any, I guess, when you guys first go to a client, is there anything that you see and you think, oh, I've seen this before a million times? Is there...
Big usability no-nos, you mean?
It's stuff you see repeatedly, I guess, from your point of view.
I'll go first. I think that the biggest thing that I see is a product that just isn't a good fit. So it's a product that's been designed, but it's not the right product that should have been designed. So I guess that whole user research process has been skipped. Someone's had a great idea, they're going, let's make this, and then we'll market it. And if it's not selling, you're not marketing it hard enough, as compared to going right back to the beginning and thinking, well, actually, who are our customers, what are their needs, and what can we do to fill those needs? You know, it's not specific to UX, right? It's a kind of entrepreneurial mindset as well to think about product management. But yeah, it can be a difficult conversation to have with a client that they've got a product that it would be like, what's the term? I'm putting lipstick on a pig. Yeah.
Polishing a turd.
What's a big thing that you see that?
I think sometimes you go to a website and you can kind of tell what's wrong with the company by looking at the website. They tend to, a lot of businesses, their websites are not user-centered or they're business-centered. So the way that they structure their navigation, the way that they organise their pages, makes sense to them inside the business, but to the user itself, it actually makes no.
Yeah, let's put the organisational structure on the homepage.
And that kind of happens quite a lot, doesn't it? That you do see this is this department and this department and this department. That makes no sense. That structure makes no sense to the user, but there's infighting between departments, and it just becomes easy for them to create their own pages, and so that's sort of a common thing that we have to try and unpick.
Jamie?
Yeah, I think time as well. Most of the client they just rush to get everything live. So sometimes you do come across client that goes, yeah, we'll hire the UX guys and they'll do all stuff. And, although we did all the research and we come up with nice design for them it's just, we just got to launch it in 1 month, and they start skipping steps. So that's when, you know, everything just kind of just falls down, and then they'll come back to you and ask you why, and you're like, the research that we showed you, you know, you are meant to do this and that, and you know, and eventually they kind of get it, yeah, but it's just a whole timing thing sometimes when they rush things too.
And
yeah.
the user research is one of the things that they want to skip sometimes too.
Yeah, I know, and they
Oh,
say,
don't worry, we won't worry about testing it with
Yeah,
users.
we
Let's
know
just
our
get it
users,
live
don't
and
worry.
we'll worry about it
Yeah,
later.
we've known them for years.
Yeah. That's why you kind of videotape everything and you say, this is exactly what they say. So it's sort of a proof to help you in the end with your work in backing things up. Yeah.
Your background in marketing, Ben, because personas is a term that are used in marketing quite frequently, but it's kind of a different thing compared to the concept of personas in user experience. How have you managed terminology and mindset about market research versus user research? And what have you learned from that?
Yeah, look, back in my marketing days, we did a lot of market research, and I used to work in FMCG marketing, so, you know, ice cream and coffee and stuff that you buy in supermarkets, and we'd get people in and do research about what they might potentially do, what ice cream they might potentially buy next time. The thing that, the big thing for me with user research is that you've got to try and explore causality, like why they actually, and what they have actually done in the past, as opposed to asking users what they might do in the future, because often, you know, it's much better to understand what they have done, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Luke, is there any big no-nos that you see recurring themes?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain reality around needing to design for an existing system, but I think if we take an example of like a car park ticket machine at the airport, a couple of years ago there was really disastrous, like you're trying to follow a process, you can't even see where to start, let alone where you go next, and it's kind of this zigzag across the hardware just because the design is catering far too much for the system. So I think you can see a similar thing in websites where you're asking too much of the user at the wrong time because of that. And probably a second one would be just trying to put too much on the page. You've got too many people having input. There's no clear vision for something. It needs to be just do one thing, do it well.
Got time for a couple more questions before we break for drinks. And
What about?
any other questions? Yes.
Yes. For those of us outside of digital marketing, those kind of fields, personally I'm a librarian. I guess could you give us some examples of unusual or atypical entries into UX from, you know, people who aren't the usual suspects?
I would have thought that being a librarian is quite close to information architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, the information architecture field is spawned out of
Library sciences.
the library sciences. So whatever skills you've got in terms of organising information, auditing content, arranging things into sensible buckets, and that's probably a pretty good grounding.
And curating content too, yeah.
Apart from someone who comes from film, anyone in your network who's had a bizarre, unusual background? I met a guy at UX Melbourne a while ago whose background was event management. And the reason why he was attracted to user experience design is because actually designing these rock festivals and thinking about the experience of someone as they enter the venue and like being able to shape the audience into like where the toilets are placed and where the cafeteria is and all that stuff. It's actually, you know, there's a lot of parallels between physical experience design and digital experience design. So, yeah.
And that's what's great about UX, I think, is that you can come up from different angles, and whether you're a librarian or an event designer, there's a story that you can kind of tell, that you can weave into how you got to wanting to be a UX designer, and there's always stuff from the past that you can tap back in on.
And a lot of those other skills about sketching and storytelling and listening and processing and critiquing and facilitating, you know, they're not specific to visual design or marketing or anything really. They're, like I said, they're kind of business skills that serve you well in a large or small organisation and in pretty much any career. Yeah. We'll take one more question up the back.
So, creating graphical user interfaces, GUIs, have always been like the user interface that's been his job. But with the new forms of like GUIs and so on, who does that fall under?
sorry, enlighten me as to what a FUI is.
VUI, like voice of user.
VUI, right.
Like Siri, it's a complete different way of tackling a problem and how you would design your VUI.
Sure. Who would like to tackle, whose job is user experience?
Yeah, so it's everyone's. This idea of a collaborative team that works together on stuff and pulling people with the right skills together. Sure, you can have someone who's good at pixels and they do visual stuff. Sure, you can have someone who's good at sound stuff and they might do, you know, responsive sound stuff. But I think one of my favourite things that I did when I was first getting into UX was this kind of impressions audit of all the touch points of a business on, you know, on their customers or users. So this idea that the way the receptionist answers the phone is just as much a part of branding, for example, as using the website interface. So I would say for that kind of stuff, rather than this sort of handoff process like waterfall, where someone does their job and then hands off to the next person and they do it and then this sort of thing, maintain a bit of fluency, you know, cross-discipline across the whole team so that everyone gets inputs at all points of that process. So it's kind of everyone's, I would say.
There's a really great book by Jeff Gothelf called Lean UX, and I mean, primarily it's marketed as a book about how to do user experience design without kind of focusing too much on deliverables that can blow your timeline. But really, the book is not... What I took away from the book was that as designers, we need to become design facilitators, and we need to involve everyone in the journey. So if you're in a team, and you need to be sitting next to the developer, or you need to be sitting next to the voice specialist or whatever else, and you need to be getting them collaborating on the design and not just be the one that does the design in a silo on your own and then hands it over. So in answer to your question, it should become everyone's job, and that's not really, I don't want that to be a cop-out, but it's true that collaborative teams kick ass. Like if you can get a great culture and a great team that are working together and everyone has input on the design rather than it being an ego thing where you are the designer and you're precious about it, then that's where the magic happens. Cool. Well, that's all we've got time for this evening. We're really appreciative that everyone's taken your time to come and join us this evening. We hope you found some value in the conversation. I will give a quick plug to our workshops again that are coming up in a couple of weeks. We're teaching about introductory user experience design, sketchnoting and UX for mobile. It's at a fabulous co-working space in Thornbury called Nest Co-working. There's a log fire, there's an office dog. It's a wonderful space.
Good experience.
Yeah, so please come out. A big shout out to Luke for giving us the venue tonight. Stick around and buy some drinks at the bar. We're very lucky to have this space to use. And a big round of applause to Rebecca for all of her sketching in the back there. If you're not signed up for the UX Mastery newsletter, then go to uxmastery.com and come and do that so you can stay in the loop. And the meetup group, if you aren't part of the meetup group, then you should join that. And please stick around and have some drinks. Thanks, everyone.